Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here today, despite all of the confusion with the tube strikes that were going to be on and then were called off and everything. Really appreciate it that you made it. And also thank you so much to Diego and Layla and everybody at the Research Forum for facilitating tonight's wonderful event. I'm Romy. I'm the director of the East Wing Biennial. And I'm just going to give a very quick introduction before handing over to Talya, who is going to talk for about an hour or so, and then we're going to head into a Q&A, so have a think about any questions you might want to ask. And then after that, we'll have a more informal chat with some drinks at the back of the room. So you have that to look forward to after. So, just for a little bit of background, this evening has been organised as part of the events programming for the 16th East Wing Biennial. For those who don't know, the East Wing Biennial is the Courtaulds' student-organised 2-year-long exhibition of professional contemporary art. And in fact, all of the works that you see on the wall around you today in this room are all part of that exhibition. So the current edition, the 16th edition, is titled Revision. In a building that is dedicated to the study of the past, we really wanted to try and analyse how we might remember without repeating, and how we can kind of think towards the future in new and innovative ways. The exhibition opened in September, and it's on until summer 2027. So although you're getting a little section of it today, we do hold monthly tours that provide a kind of unique chance to see the exhibition from start to finish, and those are on the first Sunday of every month. So if you're around and you'd like to see the rest of the show, please do come. It would be lovely to see you there. But the key questions that we wanted to invite audiences to interrogate when putting together Revision were: who writes history? Who has the right to revise it? And how can art destabilize these familiar narratives? And I think that Talya's project, We Are Here, really responds to all three of those. So I'm going to give a little introduction to Talya now as well. I'm going to read out her bio. Talya Feldman is a time-based media artist from Denver, Colorado. She earned her MFA from the HFBK Hamburg and her BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Through her intercultural and collaborative practice, Feldman generates social transformation through artistic projects that offer alternative and reparative narratives to violence. She has received global recognitions for her works combating right-wing terror in cooperation with activist and research-based networks in Europe and abroad. Feldman has achieved numerous awards, including the 2026 Kunstverein Stipendium, the 2023 German Federal Prize for Students, the 2022 Berenberg Award, the 2021 DAAD Scholarship, and the 2021 Dagesh Prize. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Talya.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Romy, for inviting me here today, and thank you all of you for being here for this talk, and all of you online as well. So I wanted to kind of start by sharing a bit of the before of this project to kind of help give a bit of context to how I got to this work that's now been growing for the past 4 years in a lot of different directions, which I'm very happy to talk about soon. I also want to start by giving a bit of a disclaimer. I think it's really important when we're talking about this topic, which is right-wing terror and violence, that if people need to take space, because I am going to be talking about a lot of loss of life in this project. And so if at any point it becomes a bit, you need a little breath, this is okay. So I think it's really important that we give space for that. So if you need to take a step out, I won't be offended, I promise. I think it's really important that we take that time. So with that, I'm going to start at the beginning. So several years ago, in 2019, in Germany, there was an antisemitic and racist attack in Halle. It's a small town in eastern Germany. And the perpetrator of this attack was very inspired by many other global far-right extremist attacks that had been going on for years before. And that includes a racist attack in Oslo, the racist attack in Christchurch, in Poway, in El Paso. It's deeply also connected to the most recent attack that happened even yesterday at the mosque in San Diego. And so all of these acts of violence are connected in the sense that the perpetrators are inspired by one another, they're influenced by radicalization online. And so this was what played into this attack in Halle in 2019, where the perpetrator was specifically targeting Jews in the synagogue, in a local synagogue, and Muslims and people of color in a local kebab shop that was just down the street. And 2 people were killed. And as part of that trial process in 2020, as myself being one of the survivors of this attack, I noticed many things. One was in the media, the representation of survivors was one that was as passive, as weak. The victims and survivors were seen as, well, it's your fault that you were there, or they were playing into the perpetrator narrative where the perpetrator was everywhere, his face, his name, and that was really ideally what he had wanted from the start. And oftentimes these attacks also carry with them written manifestos, and that was also the case in this attack. And in the manifesto, it was very clear that this notoriety was important to this attack so that it can continue other attacks, right? So you see this continuity of violence happening. But in the trial and the investigation around that attack, the German courts, the German police refused to acknowledge those continuities and those connections. And not only that, they weren't willing to acknowledge that this was a racially motivated attack. And so when you see that, you ask yourself, well, how are we supposed to prevent these things from happening in the future if we cannot acknowledge that they've been happening before and all the connections that they have to what's happening now and in the future, right? And at the same time, the investigation was often met with police officers saying, well, you know, it's not my job to investigate that. It's not my job to connect it to all these other cases in the world that we've been seeing. And so then you also ask yourself, well, then whose job is it? And so at that point, myself and a number of other survivors, researchers, other artists, we came together and we created this project. And it's a digital time mapping project that kind of looks at this case in particular in Halle in 2019, but it connects it to all other cases over time, like Christchurch and Poway, Hanau, and all of these others that I mentioned. And at the same time, it tries to educate people on this rise of extremism and online radicalization that we've been seeing in our world for the past decades. And it goes through the day itself from the perspective of those who lived it. So not from the police reports, not from the media, but from the people who were there. And that was also very important to me because so often those voices are not heard. And if there are voices heard, those voices are told that they need to play a very specific role, right? As victims, you're supposed to be sad, you're supposed to be broken, you're supposed to be weak, you're supposed to be silent in a lot of cases. You can't be critical of the police, you can't be critical of society and how the response was. And so this was also a big part of what was happening in this case. And so this was a way for me as an artist to kind of use the tools that I had to challenge that and to revise that, as we were talking about, as you were talking about in this, the premise of this entire biennial, is how do we change the narrative so that we're not contributing to the violence, for one, for what people have experienced, but we're also working to combat that violence from happening again. And that brings me to a very inspiring researcher who's based in Canada in the US. Her name is Eve Tuck, and maybe some of you have heard of her before, but something that really spoke to me at that time, I came across this letter that she had written. She's an Indigenous researcher, activist. She wrote this letter called Suspending Damage, a letter to communities. And what she talks about in this letter is the fact that as people affected by violence, so often we are kept in that violence. We're told that as victims, this is, again, as I mentioned, like you have this specific role that we as a society see. When we think of the term victim, we don't necessarily think of someone strong, of someone who's active, unfortunately, even though, of course, people affected by violence are very active in their own lives. And at the same time, I want to bring up that a really close friend of mine often says, who is also a survivor of this attack from Halle, he says, I don't want to be remembered for the worst thing that ever happened to me, because I am more than what happened to me. And so I think that's also a big part of this conversation is how do we change the narrative so that we recognize that people affected by violence are not supposed to be kept in that violence. And so often when we're doing research on these cases, these continuities that I mentioned, obviously you have, in looking at this series of attacks, even in that timeline I showed you from the project, this digital time map project, you have violence. But what I was trying to do then, and starting to do more as I moved forward in this practice, is how do we change that so that we're not focusing on the perpetrators, but we're instead focusing on the people affected and their voices, their actions, their movements in this discussion of continuities. So focusing on the voices of the people who are fighting back, fighting against that violence from continuing as a way of connecting those dots. And so this is also something that Eve Tuck talks about in the sense that she says that this research that is damage-centered, where you tell someone who has a history of violence in their community or in their self that this is who you are. But instead, what she proposes is something called desire-driven data. And what that means is that we're focusing instead on the hopes, the dreams, the movements, the actions, not just the violence. We're focusing on the people and what they're capable of and what they've been fighting for decades. And so that also led, at the time of the trial, there were a number of people across Germany who also experienced violence at different times, some even decades ago, who are still fighting for recognition of what happened to them and their families, who survived racist arson attacks, who survived gunshots, like all kinds of things. And they themselves had been fighting for this recognition in Germany for decades, some even as early as, I think the earliest family I heard from was 1979. They lost a member of their family in a racist attack in Eastern Germany. And the case was covered up. So often police, they're involved in some of the neo-Nazi networks, which I'll talk a bit about in the case of Germany. The cases were overlooked, they were covered up, and they were never investigated. And so it's only now with some new research that even families like this one from Cuba, they are only now learning that their loved one was killed in a racist attack. So this is also opening a whole nother direction that I could talk a lot about, but we'll just leave it at that. But the work itself was taking the voices of all of these people who started sending messages of solidarity. So at the time of this trial, we started receiving a number of voice messages because it was also the time of COVID. And so because people couldn't necessarily be there in person, they were sending voice messages that were explaining who they were, what they've experienced themselves, what they're fighting for, what they've been fighting for, the solidarity that they're reaching out because they understand the pain and the grief and the fear and the anger and all of the emotions that come from these experiences. And so I started collecting all of those voice messages and reaching out to the people who were sending them, who at the time didn't necessarily even know me personally, but they knew that these messages were needed. And so they agreed to let me kind of take their voices, and then in a project at the Jewish Museum in Berlin, hung these, now I'm forgetting what they're, scaffold nets. So it's at the top of my head. The scaffold netting that was connected to these old phones that played these voice messages from each part, each direction. So the speakers were the voices. It was over 18 cities, over 40, 50 voices commemorating over 30 people for over 40 years in Germany. So again, it was kind of a way to look at the continuities of violence, but look at them through the voices of the people who are here and also in memory of the people who are not here. And this was one of the voices that was part of that project. So Faruk Arslan was one of the first to send a voice message. And what he often says is, listen, please listen, because our stories come from here. Right? And so when you hear that and this call for listening, it also leads me to talk about the power of listening in the way that we need in building this solidarity and this support in combating this violence in the future. Is what does it mean to really listen to these voices? And how is that then playing into this kind of political movement that we need in order to end this violence? Another voice, so I should also preface by saying I'll bring in a number of voices now. Some of them will be in text, some of them I'll share some quotes, some of them we're going to watch a few videos as well. But this one I really wanted to bring in because Elif Kubashik, she's the wife of Mehmet Kubashik, who was killed in Dortmund in Germany in 2006. So for about a decade, there were a series of murders in Germany, and it was later discovered in 2011 that those murders as well as bomb attacks, as well as bank robberies, were conducted by a very specific group of neo-Nazis, underground neo-Nazi network called the NSU. And this network, till today, it's unknown how far wide their net reaches. The investigations have been ongoing, but also lacking in a lot of cases. In the sense that the families knew from the beginning that these were racially motivated murders, but the police pointed other directions. They blamed the families themselves. The media spun a whole narrative that these murders were called the donor murders, like the kebab shop murders, which is also a very racist term that was spreading. At the same time, they were convinced by the police, the media, society was convinced by the police that the people being murdered were actually part of gangs, they were selling drugs, they were part of nefarious underground networks, when all along the families were saying, no, we know our husbands, we know our fathers, they are good people, they contribute to this society, they contribute to this community. And it wasn't until 2011 when this network was finally revealed that people recognized that the families were right all along, right? But if they had been listened to from the beginning, perhaps not all of these murders would have happened, for one, but also the violence that they experienced as families who were grieving wouldn't have happened, right? They would have received support and they would have received what they had deserved as people, as Germans and people of that society. But something Elif Kubashik said and that she still says, is that we are here. We are part of this community, and we will continue to be part of this community. And I think that's a very powerful statement. And that's also why this project that I'm presenting to you today is called We Are Here. Because it's not just saying we are here, the names, the voices, the people, the lives of those we are remembering, but also we are here, the people who have been fighting for that remembrance for a very, very long time. So in 2022, I was invited by the Kunstverein in Hamburg to create a digital project. And at the time, I came across, in the United States, they have these apartment finding websites. And there was one website that one day had a glitch. And when you went on this website and you went to a city map to look what apartments were available, instead of showing you the available apartments, it showed you all these outlines of homes that used to be in the city before they were destroyed because of gentrification, because of highways coming in. So overnight, you had this political statement from an apartment finding website by accident that was being used by activists to say, look what has happened to our cities. We have proof that you removed these whole communities from these areas. And it was really fascinating. It was powerful. It was also beautiful to look at. It was very visually appealing, but it was inspiring in the sense that I saw that map and I thought to myself, if we could have a digital space, a mapping space where we can see what our cities used to look like, what would happen if we were to really listen to the voices of people affected, to their wishes, to their dreams, to their demands for remembrance in their cities? And what would our cities look like if we really did listen to those voices? And so that's what led to this project, Wir sind hier, in German, We Are Here. And today, what it looks like when you go to this digital website, you're met with a series of names. So these are the names of those that we are remembering. I work very closely with each family. So this is also, I'll talk a bit about the process of this project as well. But it's very important to me that at any point in the digital space, if a family says, this is not empowering for me anymore, and I don't want to be part, then they don't have to. So there's nothing is final, nothing is concrete. People can change their minds at any time, because something that I also learned through this process and through this work is remembrance is not a static thing, and it's changing all the time. And at the same time, remembrance is different for every single person. And so allowing for this room for change was really important for this project in the digital space, because what it also allows is if at one point a family says to me, we want this street name to be changed. We want this park to be renamed. We want this school to be renamed. We want people to hear our experience and who the people were in their lives that we lost. And then they come back maybe a week later and they say, actually, I want this instead, or I want that, or I need people to hear this because this is what just happened to me, and I need people to know that that's what happened to me. So that also allows in this digital space for that change to happen. And so sometimes the videos change, sometimes the names change, sometimes some of the names are removed, and this is all part of that process. When you go to the website and you see these names and you scroll over them, you're then met with a map. And the map has outlines of the places that are being claimed by the families themselves. In some cases, as I mentioned, because it's different for every person, some cases the families choose places that are part of the lives of those that they've lost. I think another important thing to recognize is something that Gisela Coleman said to me. Gisela is the grandmother of Giuliano Coleman, who was killed in Munich in 2016 in a racist attack that, again, speaking of continuities, was inspired by the attack in Oslo and many others. And she often said when we were filming for this project and when I was working with her that no one ever asks her about Giuliano's life. They only ask her about his death. And I think that's also really important to think about when working in this topic and in this field, is how are we honoring the lives and not just the deaths? And at the same time, I also want to call attention to the fact that there are other families who choose the places where the attack happened. This is important for them. Or the place where the second attack happened. And what I mean by that, I'll give a very good example, is Orhan Çalışır. He is the cousin of Şahin Çalışır. And Şahin was killed on the highway in Germany by a group of neo-Nazis in 1992. And shortly afterwards, Orhan and his family, they went to the court, and they were treated themselves like the perpetrators. They were sniffed by dogs. They felt that the courthouse made a joke of them and their family. The perpetrators themselves were standing and joking, and even though they admitted that it was racially motivated, there were three involved. Only one of them went to prison for a short time and was soon released afterwards. And so what he claimed, and this is the map that you see behind, what he claimed is the courthouse. And what he says is this is the second attack. This is where Şahin was killed a second time. This is also what he means when he says second attack. It's how we were treated afterwards, how we were treated by society, how we were treated by the police, how we were treated by the courtroom, and how we continue to be treated to today. Yeah, so even now, Şahin's case has only recently come more to the public eye, and he was commemorated for the first time in a public commemoration only a few years ago. And Orhan mentions often that a few years ago as well, his nephew, so Şahin's brother, had tried to get information from the courthouse about the case. And he was told by the courthouse that his brother deserved what happened to him, that it was a traffic accident and it was his fault, and that's what happened. And so this is also what I mean when I say the second attack, is how are people considered, how are they believed, how are they treated, even afterwards. Mehmet Kubicek, who I mentioned before, his family has been fighting since his murder in 2006, not only for recognition, for justice, for further investigation into the case, but also they have been fighting because for so long the media, as I mentioned, painted their father and their husband as a villain, as a drug addict, as a gang member. They've also been fighting to reclaim his narrative and to educate the public as to who he really was, which was a family man, a good father who cared about the community. And so they often, in their commemorations every year, they work a lot with schools, they do a lot of education work, they have what they call every year around the commemoration, they do a Kinderfest, which is like a children's festival in Dortmund. And they hosted in an area of Dortmund that they were able to rename Mehmet Kubicek Platz. So they took a space in Dortmund, and after many years of fighting the city for that space, they were able to rename it after their father. And they host this children festival there. So there's also a lot to be spoken about when it comes to what does remembrance mean? What does it look like? What do you expect it to look like, right? And so often, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, expectations of what remembrance means is oftentimes in conflict with what the remembrance is that families wish for and need. I'll explain that a bit in a little bit, but first I wanted us to watch this video of the project with the family of Mehmet Kubaschik.
Lieber Papa, ich sitze hier und versuche, Worte zu finden, die all das ausdrücken, was in mir vorgeht. Doch es fühlt sich so unvollständig an. Wie ein ungeschriebenes Kapitel in unserem gemeinsamen Leben. Du bist nicht mehr hier, aber der Schmerz darüber, dass du einfach so genommen wurdest, bleibt. Der Verlust fühlt sich an wie eine Lücke, die nie ganz geschlossen werden kann. Ich habe immer wieder daran gedacht, wie du mich ermutigt hast, mutig und selbstbewusst zu sein. Und wie du mir beigebracht hast, dass die Welt mehr ist als nur das, was jeden Tag sieht. Dein Glauben an mich hat mich in vielen Momenten getragen. Und ich versuche, diesen Glauben an mich selber weiterzutragen, auch wenn du nicht mehr da bist, um mich zu führen. Es ist schwer zu begreifen, dass du uns auf so grausame Weise entrissen wirst, dass jemand, der zu Hass und Gewalt fähig ist, dir das Leben genommen hat. Macht mich unendlich traurig und wütend. Ich frage mich immer wieder, warum ausgerechnet du? Warum dieser Hass? Du warst immer ein liebevoller Vater. Ein Mensch, der seine Familie und die Menschen um sie herum geschätzt hat. Dein Tod ist nicht nur ein Verlust für uns als Familie, sondern für die ganze Gesellschaft, die jemanden wie dich nicht mehr hat. Ich trage dich in meinem Herzen, Mama. Du hast mir so viel gegeben. Deine Weisheit, deine Stärke und deine Liebe sind tief in mir verankert. Ich werde dafür sorgen, dass dein Andenken weitergeht und dass dein Leben nicht umsonst war. Auch deine Enkelkinder, die du nie kennenlernen durftest, hätten dich so gerne in ihrem Leben gehabt. Ich erzähle ihnen auch von dir, von deinem Humor, deiner Stärke und der Art, wie du immer ein offenes Ohr hattest. Sie wissen, dass du ein besonderer Mensch warst. Und ich hoffe, dass sie, auch wenn sie dich nie persönlich erlebt haben, dich in ihrem Herzen tragen werden. Sie sind ein Teil von dir und ich werde sie in deinem Andenken erziehen, damit auch sie die Erinnerung an dich weitertragen. Der Schmerz über deinen Verlust und der fehlende Trost, dich nie wieder in den Arm halten zu können, wird mich bis zu meinem eigenen Kind begleiten. Es ist ein Schmerz, der tief in mir sitzt, der nicht vergeht und der in vielen Momenten der Stille und des Alleinseins lauter wird. Aber auch in diesem Schmerz finde ich die Stärke, weiterzugehen. Für dich, Papa, für mich und für deine Enkelkinder. In vielen Momenten, in denen ich das Gefühl habe, dass alles zu schwer ist, erinnere ich mich an dich, Papa. An deinen Humor, deine Geduld und die Wärme, die du ausgestrahlt hast. Ich hoffe, Du kannst täglich spüren, wie sehr ich dich vermisse, Mama. Und wie sehr ich dir danken möchte für all das, was du mir beigebracht hast. Du bist nicht vergessen, Mama. Niemals.
So when you go to the website, you can click on any of the names that I was showing you earlier and come to these videos, like the one that we just watched. And that was the voice of Gamsa Kubashek, who is the daughter of Mehmet Kubashek. And what you also heard was a letter she wrote herself for this project. But as I mentioned, it's so different for every person what they decide to say and how they decide to say it. Because again, so often when it comes to the media and society and how we treat survivors and families of victims, it's often we expect them to say a certain thing, to act a certain way. They're oftentimes met with people who tell them to say something very specific. And so this is also part of the project, is allowing people to share what they want and say it how they want and not dictate any part of that to them. And so for some, as Gamsa, it was important for her to write something new, to write a letter that she recited. For other families, they choose a song, they choose a poem, they choose a speech that they've given in the past at certain commemorations. And so it's always changing and it's always different. I wanted to also bring up that there are a number of places in that video that are favorite places of Gamsa's father, of Mehmet Kubashek, like the football field in Dortmund. He was a really big fan. And so part of the work that they do for his remembrance with also this children's festival is they sponsor a children's soccer team. Right? And so this is another way of bringing the memory of their father into the city of Dortmund in a positive way, but also as a way of teaching students what happened in order to combat that from the future, right? So it's another way of thinking about these continuities of violence. How do we stop them from happening again? And a lot of that comes into education. A lot of that comes into listening to these voices and to giving space in our cities in the way that they deserve to be. And so for the Kubashek family, what they've accomplished a lot. They're fighting for a lot. You saw the Mehmet Kubashek Platz that I mentioned, the plaza that they were able to rename. There's also a monument that they were able to put up outside of the train station that's also part of this video. But also there is a sign up on the tree that maybe you also saw where he was killed. And so all of those places are important for them and for this remembrance and this project in particular. For other families, they're still fighting for that kind of public space or a public monument that really determines and teaches the city of who they are and what happened. And one of those families that's also a big part of the project is the family of Sedat Gurbuz. And Sedat was killed in 2020 in Hanau in a racist attack in Hanau. It's also, again, connected to Halle, it's connected to Poway, it's connected to Christchurch. It's everything always is connected. And one of the things that the families in Hanau, there were 9 people killed in this attack. And the families have been fighting very hard to ensure that the names of the victims are the main focus and not the name of the perpetrators. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, so often these perpetrators are looking for notoriety, for fame, they want to inspire others. And so giving them that platform, giving them the name, feeds into this violence and these continuities and this cycle that we want to end. And so the families in Hanau have worked very hard with the hashtag Say Their Names to uplift the names of the victims. And at the same time, I want to also call attention to the Kubashek family again, because after this underground network was revealed, there were 3 in particular, 3 neo-Nazis in particular, whose names are completely spread out through the country. And so many people perhaps can tell you the names of the perpetrators, but they can't tell you the name of Mehmet Kubushik, for instance. And I think that that's also something that the families of the NSU victims have been fighting against. But also, I think, in a lot of ways, the families in Hanau learned from that, in the sense that they knew that that was the direction that so often society and the media takes. And so they jumped as soon as they could, as soon as this attack happened, to put the names forward and to try to refocus the narrative, to change the way that we're talking about these attacks so that we focus on the people affected, we focus on the survivors and the victims. And so one of the families that's been part of this project, the family of Sedat, Emish Gorbu is his mother, she's claimed a number of places. The place where their initiative that they formed after the attack, where they are, the hashtag say their names, the grave where she visits often, but also outside of Hanau. They live outside of Hanau, and it was really important for her to put a monument there also, because as she likes to say, like, her son is, this is where her son was born, this is where he grew up, this is who he is. He's part of this town. And so they were able to put up, as you can see in this kind of the top right there, this monument. And when we were filming, there were a number of people who came up to us, and I say us because over the years I've been able to kind of build a connection, a small team, so I'm not the only one going out and filming, but I usually have someone with me. One of those people sadly couldn't be here today, but her name is Rachel Spicker, and she's a huge part of this work. Her background is in systemic counseling, and so also a very different field than where I'm coming from as an artist, but an equally important one in valuing this work and kind of spreading it into the different fields that it's existed in. And so I was with Rachel and we were filming, and Sedat's family was there with us. So another part of this process is sometimes the families decide that they want to go with us to film. And this is also an important moment because for many of them, they haven't been back to a lot of these places that are important, like the schools or the parks where their children played, or the street where they grew up or where the attack happened. And so giving that space and time as part of the process, I often say, is probably the most important part of this project, even more than the videos and the website itself. But the relationships that we build and the time that we give, as I mentioned before, as Gisela pointed out, to the life of these people. And so we were standing there in front of this monument and filming with Sedat's parents. And a number of people came up to us and were like, this is just some foreigner monument. Another man came up and said, this shouldn't be here, this should be in a cemetery, that's where Remembrance belongs, it shouldn't be here. And at that point, Sedat's mother, Emish, went up to this man and said, it's people like you who kill Sedat a second time. And I think that's also a big part of this conversation when we're talking about public space and remembrance, and we're talking about continuities of violence. And how do we make sure that we are not continuing those cycles of violence, we're not contributing to those cycles of violence, and we're also not continuing what Orhan specified as this second attack, right? How are we treating, how are we commemorating, how are we respecting and giving space to people who have experienced violence, or respecting when they don't want that space? Because I also think that for many people, remaining silent is their own way of showing resistance and resilience in their way. And that's also part of this, what does it mean to listen? And what does it mean to also respect the silence and the power that that silence can also mean in this work? And I want to also bring in one of the quotes from Emish's video, because I think it also helps express what I mentioned before, that I that I told you I would come back to. So here I am coming back to it. So often when we also talk about public remembrance, even when the cities themselves are open to it and they're saying, okay, we can do this commemoration in the city, I should premise by saying oftentimes the cities refuse because they don't want to remember, to the point that some families are told by officials, city officials, we don't want to remember because it makes us look bad. Instead of saying we want to remember because we want to ensure that these lives are respected and that this doesn't happen again, that we won't let it happen again in our city. And so something that Amish is bringing up here is also there are times when the cities comply, so to speak, where they say, fine, we can do this commemoration, but we dictate what that commemoration is, rather than listening to the families and what they wish for, what they need, what they ask for. So in some cases, the cities will even put up a monument without the permission of the families and then say to them, well, we did it, we put up a monument, so therefore we don't need to do anything else for you. And in this case, too, what Amish is saying here is that we want a memorial. We want it in the square because our children are a part of this city and deserve to be remembered. And instead, the city responded by saying, we will do a commemoration for you, but it's a silent commemoration. And so she fights back on that in her speech for this project and for the film, in saying that I refuse to accept that. It's a very powerful voice, very powerful video. And in these last minutes, I also want to bring one more video. I mentioned Gisela Coleman before, another family who lost their child in this attack in Munich in 2016 is the family of John Layla. And I wanted to bring them in as well because I think they also touch upon all of the things that I've been talking about in this project, in this talk, is about what does it mean to listen to the families? What have they experienced? What do they continue to experience? What do they hope for the future? Because I think that's also a big part of what it means to listen, is that in these voices, yes, there is tremendous grief and pain, but there's also so much strength and power and hope for the future. And I think when we listen, we can also be offered a way of moving forward, a way of imagining a better future in processing, in listening, in acting on what we're hearing from these voices.
Mein lieber Sohn John, mein Leben ist seit 6 Jahren ohne dich. Ich vermisse dich. Ich suche dich. Aber überall sehe ich nur diese dunkle Nebel. Ich spüre diese Schwernis, meinen Schmerz und meine Sehnsucht. Ich finde keine Blut. Wie sehr vermisse ich unsere gemeinsame Zeit. Ich suche trotzdem meine Erinnerungen und ich könnte dir stundenlang erzählen, wie du mein Leben in Schönheit erfüllt hast. Jetzt bin ich ohne dich. Und ich spüre einen tiefen Schmerz, dass ich meine Liebe nicht mehr mit dir erleben kann. Und du, ich nehme an, du bist jetzt an einem schönen Ort, den man das Himmelreich nennt. Dort, wo es keine Verfolgung gibt. Wo das Leben von Kindern nicht missachtet wird und es gerecht und gewissenhaft zugeht. Wenigstens hoffe ich es. Daran möchte ich glauben. Dafür strenge ich mich an. Denn mit deinem grausamen Tod habe ich mit dir auch alle meine Gewissheiten verloren. Würden wir doch nur den Menschen auf dieser Welt nicht das Wasser ziehen, wir werden unterteilen. vielleicht müssten wir dann nicht all das durchleben, was jetzt Realität ist. Und diese Realität ist für uns die Hölle. Wir haben in diesen 6 Jahren um Gerechtigkeit gekämpft, uns abgekämpft und gequält, aufgestiegen, gegen alle Widerstände, während die Beteiligten an diesem Attentat weiterhin ungestört und ungehindert da draußen gewesen sind, weiter aktiv in ihrem Nazi-Netzwerk sind. Der mitschuldige Philipp Körber, der dem Attentäter die Tat erst möglich gemacht hat, weil er ihm illegal Waffe und Munition verkauft hat, ist seit einem Jahr vorzeitig aus der Haft und man hat es nicht für geboten gehalten, uns darüber zu informieren. Es wird gesagt, dass es in diesem Fall zu keinen Ermittlungsvorschlägen kommt. Dabei war es offensichtlich, dass man die Akte so schnell nicht schließen wollte, obwohl es viele Hinweise durch Zeugenaussagen aus dem Nazi-Milieu gab, denen man hat nachgehen. Für sie ist der Fall abgeschlossen, aber für mich nicht. Denn wir werden hier als Einwanderer weiter bedroht. Wir sind weiter einem tödlichen Rassismus ausgesetzt. Ja, das macht mich nervös. Das beunruhigt mich zutiefst. Man sagt uns, dass man unsere Gefühle, dass wir die Möglichkeiten der Pseudodemokratie nutzen, aber auch zu beordnen und uns unterzuordnen haben. Angesichts der Lage heißt das im Grunde, du musst damit leben, dass man Menschen wie dich töten muss. Und wenn es passiert, nimm dein Schicksal. Geordnet und mich unterordnen soll ich mich auch, wenn es um die Vorbereitung der jährlichen Eventveranstaltung geht. Als Angehörige habe ich keinerlei Mitspracherechte. Wer sprechen darf und wer nicht. Jedes Jahr stehen wir mit unserem Anliegen vor einem Mann, mit der sich der Menschen von uns abstimmt. Auch mein rechtlicher Beistand wurde mir angestellt. Ich habe in diesen 6 Jahren gelernt, dass es keine Gerechtigkeit und keine Kontrolle gibt. Es schmerzt mich. Menschen, die Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit begehen, werden geschützt. Eine so große Ungerechtigkeit verletzt mich zutiefst. Dieses System trägt Menschen auf Händen, die Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit begangen haben. Es ist eine gefährliche Welt, in der unter dem Namen Mensch eine innerlich hohe Gemeinschaft besteht, die nicht davon hält, gute Menschen zu sein, Gutes für andere zu tun und sie wertzuschätzen. Diese Gemeinschaft schreckt nicht davor zurück, Böses zu tun und andere Böses tun zu lassen. Und in dieser Welt gibt es Menschen, die angesichts all dem schweigen und sie glauben desto mehr daran, Recht zu haben, je mehr sie schweigen. Die Ungerechtigkeit in diesem Land zeigt sich darin, dass wir selbst um Gerechtigkeit kämpfen müssen. Und wenn wir nicht darum kämpfen und es in die Händen der Polizei und Politik geben, befürchte ich, dass immer wieder auf unermesslichen Leid kommen wird. Ich habe keinerlei Vertrauen mehr in die Justiz gestellt. Die deutsche Justiz ist angesichts der rechten Terroranschläge gescheitert. Die Gesetze mit den Füßen getreten und danach gänzlich abgelehnt. Lieber vertraue jenen Menschen, die ihre Augen nicht verschließen und sich durch ihr Gewissen und Gefühl für freiwillig solidarisch zeigen, die sich für ein gerechtes und menschenwürdiges Zusammenleben in der Gesellschaft einsetzen und die Ungerechtigkeiten nicht hinnehmen und nicht schweigen werden. Ich habe von den Menschen so viel echte Einheit erfahren und die Kraft tiefer Begegnungen gespürt, dass mich das wieder hoffen und glauben lässt. Und ich möchte besonders den jungen Menschen raten, diese Welt gehört euch, gebt eure Zukunft, eure Träume, eure Hoffnung nicht in diese Schnipsel hinein. Solange nicht alle hier sind, gebe ich meine Hoffnung nicht auf. Mein lieber Sohn, du würdest durch Popel getötet. Und wir werden nicht aufhören, bis alle, die daran mitgewirkt haben, zur Verantwortung gezogen werden. Wir werden nicht schweigen und nicht vergessen lassen. Solange Menschen ermordet werden, werden wir nicht aufhören, darauf hinzuweisen, dass es dort Grausamkeiten gibt. Aber wie so ihn verdienen.
I had a few more videos, but I think I think we're good on time. And maybe I just end by saying the project itself, it's grown in a lot of ways over the last 4 years, and into exhibition spaces, panel talks, the catalog in the back, please help yourself. It was from an exhibition of the project at the NS Documentation Center in Munich 2 years ago. And we're also now working on a book. So the book will come out in January of 2027. And the book is more thorough interviews with a lot of the families that I talked about, with Orhan, family of Mehmet Kubashik, and many, many others, with Sibel Leila, whose voice you just heard, the mother of John Leila, Gisela Coleman, who I mentioned. And so I think it will also help give even more depth and more meaning to the project and to the work that all of these families and these people have been doing in their activism and in their fight for, as Sybil said, for justice, for remembrance and recognition, and for change. And so thank you all very, very much. We're on Instagram, and here's the QR for the website as well.